Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. Part 7, The Terminal, Chapter 45. The interview in year 15 continued. Ramon: do you have any more questions? Diallo: I do have more questions, but you didn't want to answer them. Ramon: I'll answer if you don't record me. Francois Diallo set his pen and notebook on the table. Thank you, Kirsten said. I'll answer your questions now if you'd like, but only if these ones don't go in your newspaper. Agreed. When you think of how the world's changed in your lifetime, what do you think about? I think of killing. Her gaze was steady. Really? Why? Have you ever had to do it? Francois sighed. He didn't like to think about it. I was surprised in the woods once. I've been surprised, too. In the evening, Francois had lit a candle in the library. It stood in the middle of a plastic tub for safety. The candlelight softened the scar on Kirsten's left cheekbone. She was wearing a summer dress with a faded pattern of white flowers on red three-sheathed knives in her belt. How many? He asked. She turned her wrist to show the knife tattoos. 2. The Symphony had been resting in New Petoskey for a week and a half so far, and Francois had interviewed almost all of them. August had told him about walking away from his empty house in Massachusetts with his violin, falling in with a cult for 3 years before he walked away again and stumbled across the Symphony. Viola had a harrowing story about riding a bicycle west out of the burnt-out ruins of a Connecticut suburb, age 15, harboring vague notions of California, but set upon by passerby long before she got there. Grievously harmed, joining up with other half-feral teenagers in a marauding gang, and then slipping away from them, walking alone for 100 miles, whispering French to herself because all the horror in her life had transpired in English, and she thought switching languages might save her, wandering into a town through which the Symphony passed 5 years later. The third cello had buried his parents after both died in the absence of insulin, and then spent 4 years holed up in the safety and boredom of their remote cottage in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Set out finally because he'd feared he'd lose his mind if he didn't find another human being to talk to, also because you can eat only so much venison before you give your right arm to eat almost anything else. Made his way south and east and over the Mackinac Bridge 10 years before the bridge's center section collapsed. Lived on the outskirts of the close-knit band of fishermen in Mackinac City until the Symphony passed through. When it came down to it, Francois had realized all of the Symphony's stories were the same, in 2 variations. Everyone else died. I walked. I found the Symphony. Or, I was very young when it happened. I was born after it happened. I have no memories, or few memories, of any other way of living, and I've been walking all my life. Well, tell me yours, she said. What do you think about? When I think of how the world's changed, you mean? Yes. My apartment in Paris. Francois had been on vacation in Michigan when air travel had ceased. When he closed his eyes, he could still see the intricate moldings of his parlor ceiling, the high white doors leading out to the balcony, the wood floors, and books. Why do you think of killing? You never had to hurt anyone in the old world, did you? Of course not. I was a copywriter. A what? Advertising. He hadn't thought about it in a long time. You know, billboards and such. Copywriters wrote the words on them. She nodded, and her gaze drifted away from him. The library was Francois's favorite place in his present life. He had accumulated a sizable collection over the years. Books, magazines, a glass case of pre-collapsed newspapers. It had only recently occurred to him to start a newspaper of his own, and thus far the project had been invigorating. Kirsten was looking at the improvised printing press, massive in the shadows at the back of the room. How did you get that scar on your face? He asked. She shrugged. I've actually no idea. It happened during that year I don't remember. Your brother never told you before he died? He said it was better if I didn't remember. I took his word for it. What was he like, your brother? He was sad, she said. He remembered everything. You've never told me what happened to him. The kind of stupid death that never would have happened in the old world. He stepped on a nail and died of infection. She glanced up at the window at the failing light. I should go, she said. It's almost sunset. She stood, and the handles of the knives in her belt glinted in the half-light. This wire of a woman, polite but lethal, who walked armed with knives through all the days of her life. He'd heard stories from other symphony members about her knife-throwing abilities. She was supposedly able to hit the center of targets blindfolded. I thought tonight was just the musicians, reluctant as always to see her go. It is, but I told my friends I'd come. Thank you for the interview. He was walking her to the door. You're welcome. If you don't mind me asking, why didn't you want that last part to be recorded? It isn't the first time I've heard confessions of this nature. I know, she said. Almost everyone in the symphony. But, look, I collect celebrity gossip clippings. Celebrity gossip? Just about that one actor, Arthur Leander. Because of my collection, the clippings, I understand something about permanent records. And it isn't something you want to be remembered for. Exactly, she said. Are you coming to the performance? Of course, I'll walk with you. He went back to blow out the candle. The street had fallen into shadow now, but the sky was still bright over the bay. The symphony was performing on a bridge a few blocks from the library. The caravans parked off to the side. Francois heard the first notes, the cacophony of musicians practicing their sections and tuning up. August was playing the same two measures over and over, frowning. Charlie was studying the score. Earlier, a few of the townspeople had carried benches down the hill from the town hall, arranged now in rows facing the bay. Most of the benches were occupied, the adults talking amongst themselves or watching the musicians, the children spellbound by the instruments. There's some space in the back row, Kirsten said, and Francois followed her. What's the program tonight? A Beethoven symphony. I'm not sure which one. At some undetectable cue, the musicians stopped practicing and tuning and talking amongst themselves, took their places with their backs to the water, and fell silent. A hush came over the assembled crowd. The conductor stepped forward in the stillness, smiled at the audience, and bowed, turned without a word to face the musicians and the bay. A seagull glided overhead. The conductor raised her baton.